Where do Buddhists live today? Are any estimates of numbers available?
Buddhism enjoyed much greater success in other parts of Asia than in India, the land of its birth. Estimates of the global population of Buddhists varies from about a third to half a billion. Political circumstances make statistics particularly hard to get for China and Tibet. But it is clear that Buddhists have suffered terribly in both areas during the past half-century. Meanwhile, the tradition has been enjoying modest revival elsewhere in Asia, and has become increasingly popular in Europe and North America as a result of both immigration and conversion. Nations with the highest percentage of Buddhists among the general population are Thailand, 94%, Cambodia, 90%, Myanmar, formerly Burma, 88%, Japan, 78%, and Korea, 45%. Many millions of Buddhists once lived in China, but their number dwindled dramatically with the advent of the communist system. Buddhism has been making a comeback in China in recent years, and there are now an estimated 13,000 temples and 200,000 monks and nuns. Tibet's population was, until recently at least, almost entirely Buddhist. Between 600,000 and a million Buddhists, representing all major denominations, live in the United States.
What place does Muhammad occupy in Islamic tradition?
Muslims consider Muhammad the last in a line of prophets, commissioned to act as God's spokesman to humankind, beginning with Adam and continuing down through Jesus. The pre-Islamic prophets preached the same fundamental message of belief in one sovereign transcendent God. But because successive generations invariably found the message difficult and inconvenient, people sometimes corrupted or diluted the revelation. Hence, God chose upright individuals to reassert the original revelation.
How do Daoism and CCT commemorate death and mourning ritually?
Special rites are designed for those approaching death, for burial day and for subsequent memorials. For the elderly and terminally ill, ceremonies can include rituals related to aging and specific illnesses. Prayers for longevity might include, for example, recitation from the scripture called the Northern Dipper's Extension of Life. Traditional funerals conducted under Daoist auspices can be very elaborate. At many funerals, a central feature is the recitation of scripture, often performed, curiously, by Buddhist monks or nuns. Many Chinese, both in China and in places like Malaysia where there are sizable Chinese communities, still choose to bury their dead in distinctive graves. A horseshoe-shaped stone or concrete enclosure is set into a gentle slope with the open side to the south and the arms of the horseshoe inclining toward the south. following the principles of Feng Shui. The enclosure helps to contain the maximum positive qi while allowing necessary drainage. Burial ceremonies typically conclude with placing a memorial or name tablet atop the coffin during final prayers. The coffin is then buried, head to the south, within the semicircular enclosure. Family members take the tablet home for installation on the domestic altar. Weekly rituals held from the 7th to the 49th day after death may be even more complex than that of the actual burial. Salvation rituals are especially important in cases of violent or premature death. In order to liberate such unfortunate souls, a ritual of crossing over is designed to shatter the very portals of the underworld. The so-called Ghost Festival, held either at the end of a cosmic renewal or on the 15th day of the 7th month, placates the hungry spirits with often elaborate offerings and animal sacrifice presided over by 7 officiants. For those who died before being able to marry, posthumous spirit marriages engage a living proxy to marry the deceased person symbolically, while allowing the proxy to proceed with his or her marriage plans in due course.
What is Shinto and what are its origins?
Shinto derives from 2 Chinese words Shen, meaning deity, and Dao, meaning way. The Japanese reading of the Chinese expression comes out Kami no Michi, the path of the Kami. Since at least several centuries BCE, the Japanese have acknowledged the sacred presence and power of numinous beings called Kami, high or superior beings. Until about the middle of the 6th century CE, the Japanese people evidently did not think of their ancient religious traditions as a separate system. So organically integrated were those traditions with their entire culture and heritage that worship of the Kami was largely assumed as the Japanese way. Only with the arrival of Buddhism, called in Japanese the way of the Buddha, Butsudo, did it become necessary to give the indigenous beliefs and practices a name to distinguish them from this imported tradition. Unlike many other major traditions, Shinto had neither a founder nor a single foundational figure who represents concrete historical origins. In a sense, Shinto is as old as Japan itself, somewhat the way Hinduism is as old as India. At its core, the way of the Kami enshrines profound insights into the sacred character of all created nature. Shinto calls people to a deep awareness of the divine presence suffusing all things, to the challenge of personal and corporate responsibility for the stewardship of the world that is home, to unending gratitude for all that is good, and to a willingness to seek purification and forgiveness for humanly inevitable but avoidable lapses. Observe worshippers at a Shinto shrine. As Buddhism has temples, Shinto has shrines, and there can be little doubt of the sincere devotion that moves so many people to prayer and ritual expression of their beliefs.
What is the human ideal in Confucianism?
Confucian teaching describes the epitome of the ideal society as the superior person, Junzi. That means an individual who arrives at a high level of personal development through self-discipline and inquiry. The superior person values justice more highly than profit, and prefers to be quiet and serene rather than vulgar and ungenial. Cultivating a dignified manner, the superior person nevertheless avoids arrogance. Such a person looks first to his or her personal shortcomings rather than blaming others for their lack of understanding or appreciation. It is said that the way of the superior person is a lengthy journey that begins from right here. 5 constant virtues characterize the superior person: self-respect, generosity, sincerity, responsibility, and openness to others. Expanding on the earlier teaching of Confucius, Mengzi taught that fully developed human life begins with 4 principles. Compassion leads to true humanity, shame leads to righteousness. Reverence and respect to propriety, and a sense of moral value to wisdom. Behind the notion of the superior person lies a deep-seated conviction of human potential for almost unlimited moral growth.
Who was the Grand Inquisitor and what was the Inquisition?
Since the 2nd or 3rd centuries, Christians have used inquisitions, with a small I, to root out unacceptable theological views called heresies. During the 13th century, Emperor Frederick II made heresy hunting the responsibility of the state. In response, Pope Gregory IX thought it best to claim that prerogative for the Church. He set up a court of inquisitors from the Dominican and Franciscan orders, charging them to identify wayward persons. Those accused of heresy had a month to recant before undergoing a formal trial with at least 2 witnesses. Unrepentant persons found guilty could be jailed and tortured. The most serious offenders could be turned over to civil authorities and executed, typically by being burned at the stake. Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella established their own version of the Inquisition. In 1479, Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity were their initial targets. But they eventually sent their Grand Inquisitor, Torquemada, after Protestants as well. Even people who are now famous saints, such as Ignatius Loyola, were occasionally required to give an account of themselves. The Spanish Inquisition lasted until the early 19th century.
What about ordinary people incapable of such lofty feats?
They can still hope to receive an immortal body after resurrection. A belief with some similarity to classic Christian notions of bodily resurrection. Another important distinction between deist notions of salvation and For example, Christian beliefs is that there is no single savior figure in deist thought.
Where do Confucians live today? Are any estimates of numbers available?
Compared to the hundreds of millions whose cultures and ways of thinking have been profoundly influenced by Confucian teaching, people who identify themselves exclusively as Confucians are relatively few in number. In China, the ancestral home of Confucianism, very few people today think of themselves as Confucians. Many Confucian temples survived the demise of imperial rule, and the founders of the original Chinese Republic in 1911 continued to hold Confucius and the sages in the highest reverence. As a result of the Maoist revolution in 1948, however, hundreds of institutions associated with Confucian tradition were destroyed, damaged severely, or shut down. Since the Cultural Revolution, which ended with Mao's death in 1976, some of those institutions have enjoyed a revival. Countless citizens of the People's Republic of China revere Confucius but are not likely to call themselves Confucians. This is also true of Koreans and Japanese, a very small minority of whom will identify Confucian tradition as their principal ethico-religious affiliation.
Have relics ever been part of Hindu practice?
Concern over the sacred remnants of human embodiments of holiness, often called relics, does not play as important a role in Hindu tradition as in, say, Christianity or Buddhism. One reason is that Hindu myth describes the whole earth as sacred. All of creation is itself the body of God. With that kind of pervasive sense of holiness, reminders of the holiness of individual human beings are hardly necessary. Even so, Hindu popular devotional practice displays an ample array of concrete symbols that function much the way relics do in other traditions. One fine example is the use of sacred footprints called petukas. Footprints of Vishnu often appear in paintings, small items of jewelry, and metal stamps with which devotees can apply inked impressions of the deity's 2 feet. Especially sacred are the feet and sandals of one's guru. Devotees sometimes gather to collect the water and other materials used to bathe either the Holy One's feet, or, in his absence, an image of his feet called the Sri Petuka. Devotees often convey the petukas of famous saints on wagons in procession, as they sing of their desire to be at sacred feet of the Holy One.
Does that mean Hindus do not believe in heaven or hell?
Traditional Hindu cosmologies speak of 3 realms of existence or lokas. One scheme describes an in-between realm, Antarloka. where individual souls abide both during sleep and between incarnations. This reflects the persistence of important features of ancient Vedic views of the cosmos. A version of hell called Naraka, literally, referring to humankind, is a thoroughly unpleasant lower part of the Antarloka that functions rather like a purgatory. In any of its 7, or even as many as 21 levels, souls can overcome through suffering some of the effects of bad karma. A multi-leveled region called Anandloka, realm of bliss, also called Svarga, region of light, is roughly equivalent to a paradise or heaven. It is a temporary abode in which people who have died approaching liberation acquire knowledge that can assist them toward greater spiritual progress in their next life. Hindu cosmology includes multiple levels, both in this in-between realm and in the uppermost realms beyond that reserved for those who have achieved moksha. Most Hindus regard the intermediate equivalents of heaven and hell as temporary, although some smaller sects teach the existence of more or less permanent abodes of punishment in the next life.
After Muhammad died and the Arab armies expanded into new territories and encountered new cultures and religious communities, the Muslims had to confront countless problems previously unknown. How would they deal with issues that neither the Quran nor the Hadith addressed?
Local Muslim leaders often had to improvise, exercising their best personal judgment and acting as they believed Muhammad would have done. They strove to perpetuate the Prophet's example, his sunnah. But authorities and leading scholars in Medina, and later in other cities, looked for ways to standardize the procedure of extending the application of Quran and Hadith to changing circumstances. They gradually agreed that one could solve problems not treated directly in Quran and Hadith by appealing to the actual practice of the local community or to the consensus. Ijma, pronounced IJMAA, of legal scholars. But since some questions were too new for any consensus to have developed, scholars agreed that one could apply a form of reasoning by analogy, qiyas, pronounced qyaas, that followed strict rules so as to keep the process as free of personal whim as possible. Leading legal scholars in different cities devised slightly different formulas for using the four roots of the law: Quran, Hadith, consensus, and analogical reasoning, some allowing greater latitude in appealing to the third and fourth roots. Four legal methodologies dominant among Sunni Muslims came to be called the schools, madhabs, while several other distinctively Shi'i schools eventually developed as well.
Who is Gandhi and why is he so important?
Like the Jade Emperor, Gandhi, also known as Guangong, claims a place in both Daoist and CCT pantheons. He has the additional distinction of ranking high in the upper echelons of the imperial cult, and through that channel connects with Confucian tradition as well. Guandi was originally a military man of the 3rd century, named Guan Yu, who was executed after enemies of the Han dynasty captured him in battle. The court funded temples in his honor and publicized his cause. Meanwhile, the newly deified Guandi was gaining popularity among practitioners of CCT as a refuge from problems as diverse as illness, bad weather, and failing business. The ever-ready all-purpose deity thus rose to such prominence that his popular cult situated him above even the Jade Emperor. In the 17th century, a Ming dynasty emperor conferred on Guandi the title of Grand Emperor. During the following regime, that of the Qing or Manchu, Guandi received the title under which he is perhaps most widely known: Military Emperor or Wu Di, thus making him the official guardian of the empire. Guandi's celebrity represents a relatively recent development. Unlike many of the older deities, whose imagery and entourage were typically patterned on those of the imperial bureaucracy, Guandi is reminiscent of the Buddhist bodhisattva. In fact, some scholars suggest Guandi also was absorbed into certain Buddhist groups after the 7th century. It seems likely that, as in the case of other indigenous Chinese deities, Guandi was first depicted under the general influence of Buddhism's use of sculpture. He appears as a very tall man with a very long beard and a red face, sometimes accompanied by his son. Variant versions of his story give somewhat different details. As in the popular classic Chinese novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, of which Guandi is the hero. Many popular theatrical presentations based on the novel have become a major vehicle for the spread of Guandi's popularity.
What is holy water and how do some Christians use it?
Roman and Anglo-Catholics especially are accustomed to blessing themselves when they enter church. They dip their right hand into a font filled with holy water and make the sign of the cross on themselves. Water is also a medium of blessing for a congregation. The celebrant takes a branch, or uses a small sprinkler with a handle, dipped in water, and scatters a few drops over the crowd. Water from pilgrimage sites has long been a favorite religious souvenir, sometimes brought home to be given away as gifts or used for its healing properties. For many Christians, this is all an extension of the use of water for the rite of baptism, which in turn recalls how God brought the Israelites safely through the waters of the Red Sea and the Jordan River, and how Jesus was blessed by his cousin John the Baptist.
What is a mandala? Is it the same as a thanka?
Mandala is a Sanskrit word for circle. As a two-dimensional design, a mandala is equivalent to the plan of a stupa. Viewed directly from above, a stupa reveals a series of alternating concentric square and circular shapes. From the outside in, you see the square foundation, the circular earth mound, the square altar inside its square railing, and finally the circular discs mounted on the shaft of the spire. Some mandalas depict 4 gates on the sides of the foundation square and add yet another outer circle symbolizing the 8 cemeteries through which a meditator must first pass, becoming oblivious to the senses and all other distractions before entering the sacred space. Vajrayana and other esoteric Buddhist sects adapted this bird's-eye perspective on the stupa and interpreted it as an image of both the macrocosm, the whole spiritual cosmos, and the microcosm, the individual meditator. Devotees meditate on the sacred design of the spiritual city as they move symbolically inward from the gates toward the center and enlightenment. Various deities and forms of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are depicted in the different spaces of the mandala, each symbolizing some aspect of spiritual power. Tibetan monks sometimes create large mandalas using grains of colored sand. After many hours of work, they conduct rituals around it and then discard it in a river as a reminder of impermanence and non-attachment. Thanka is a more generic term for a Tibetan wall hanging depicting a religious theme. Some thankas depict mandalas, and some display sacred imagery of other kinds. Multiple scenes illustrating Jataka tales offer material designed for meditation on essential virtues modeled by the Buddha to be
What does the term Babylonian exile, or captivity, refer to?
The kingdom of Judah had come under military and political pressure in the late 700s BCE. Around the time of the fall of the northern kingdom, some southern kings even paid tribute as vassals to Assyria. In the year 597 BCE, the Babylonians, successors to the Assyrians as the major regional power, were closing in on Jerusalem. Though the city would hold out for another 10 years, the invaders captured and deported to Mesopotamia a number of leading Jews. In 587/6 BCE, the Babylonians laid final siege to Jerusalem, destroying the temple. They and other Middle Eastern powers had found it useful to take important Jews into exile, the better to demoralize the subject peoples and ensure the success of the conquering regime. Exact numbers are impossible to reconstruct, but the total deportation seems to have uprooted as many as 20,000 people. Since only the poorest and least educated were left behind, the exile amounted to a virtually total elimination of Jewish presence in Jerusalem and its environs. The good news was that the community would realize the possibility of taking root in a new land. Prophets preached a message of encouragement and survival, devising a whole new exilic theology built around the hope of restoration and return. Enter the Achaemenid Persian Empire stage left, exit Babylon stage right. Jewish fortunes changed under the new sovereigns of the central Middle East. In 539 BCE, Persian monarch Cyrus the Great decided to release the captives and allow them to return to Jerusalem.
What is the caste system?
India's ancient Hindu social system combines several complex elements. Perhaps best known are the four principal varnas or social classes. The term varna means color or appearance. As early as the Vedic period, the Brahmin or priestly class rose to the top of the social ladder. They were responsible for maintaining the integrity of ritual practice and traditional teaching. Nowadays Brahmins are by no means all connected with priestly activities as such. One rung below the Brahmins are the Kshatriyas, those who govern. Traditionally called the warrior or princely class. They have been the legislators as well as enforcers of the law. On the next lower rung are the more numerous merchants, financiers, agriculturalists, and industrialists who comprise the Vaishya class. As class designations, the terms Kshatriya and Vaishya are now obsolete. Most numerous of all are the Shudras, the laborers and craftspersons who perform the basic services. Varna distinctions generally cut across language, occupational and geographical barriers. In addition to the four varnas are the hundreds, perhaps even as many as 4,000, of jatis. Jati means birth or species and refers to the countless local social groups defined by occupation and language. As many as 25,000 additional groupings are called subcastes. Members of both jatis and subcastes generally associate themselves with one of the varnas. And many Indians still observe strict rules of purity and separation. Finally, between 1 and 200 million people are considered outcasts. Untouchables, or unscheduled classes, those who don't fit in the great system. Since India gained independence, the caste system has been officially illegal. But systems of such antiquity do not yield readily to legislation passed in capital cities.
Do deists and practitioners of CCT make pilgrimages?
Pilgrimage has long been integral to most of the major Chinese religious traditions. The Chinese term typically translated as making pilgrimage, Chao Shan Jin Xiang, actually means paying respects to a mountain by presenting incense. Beginning in at least the 4th century CE and growing dramatically from the 8th to 12th centuries. Pilgrimage practices of the various traditions came to be identified with certain specific mountains, with some mountains claimed by more than one tradition. Once identified as a particularly sacred place, a mountain became the site of one or more temples. Eventually deists and others developed elaborate sacred geographies, mapped out with reference to the major sacred peaks or ranges. Pilgrimage to the sacred mountains thus became a symbolic journey through the universe. On some mountains, such as Wudangshan, deists have constructed miniature versions of the macro cosm. identifying its subdivisions with such enchanting names as Jade Void, Primordial Harmony, Purple Empyrean, and Perfect Felicity. Mountains are the dwelling places of the gods and immortals, and as such, naturally became favorite places of retreat for deist scholars and masters. Mountain settings have other, more primal, symbolism for deists as well. They embody the perfect harmony of male yang and female yin. Deep within mountain caves, spiritual seekers could contact the eternal feminine energies. Popular pilgrimage has generally revolved around visits to the mountain temples rather than around extended spiritual retreat. A deity called generically the Old Man of the Mountain, often depicted with his pet tiger, appears in many temples all over Asia, including Buddhist sites, making a symbolic pilgrimage possible even for those who cannot manage the actual journey. Today, various organizations arrange pilgrimage tours to any of several dozen sacred sites in the People's Republic and in Taiwan.
Do deists and practitioners of CCT use relics?
Given the importance of ancestor veneration in Chinese religious traditions generally, one might expect that relics would enjoy considerable prominence. That does not appear to be the case, however. People pay homage to the dead in various ways, but rarely attribute to their mortal remains or residual personal effects the kind of miraculous power typically associated with relics in traditions like Buddhism and Christianity. Amulets of various kinds offer protection, and these may include the equivalent of second or third-class relics. Personal effects of a holy person, or items said to have come in contact with the holy remains.
How do Jews conduct their regular communal liturgical worship?
A feature of ritual practice common to all Jewish congregations is the reading of Scripture. Ancient Palestinian custom used a cycle in which Sabbath readings completed the whole Torah in a 3-year cycle. Some Reform and conservative communities have reinstituted that practice in recent times. Orthodox and Reconstructionist congregations continue to use the ancient Babylonian custom of a 1-year cycle of 54 Siddharim. On Mondays, Thursdays, and Sabbath mornings and afternoons, as well as on new moons and special religious festivals, Jews read Torah in the synagogue. Regular Sabbath readings follow the Torah in order, continuously, from Genesis through Deuteronomy. Readings for the various feasts and fasts are chosen specially for the occasion and do not follow a continuous cycle. In addition, texts from the former and latter prophets, but not from the writings, are selected as a kind of parallel or commentary on the day's Torah texts. These supplementary readings, used on Sabbaths, fasts, and feasts, are called Haftarah. Some theorize that the practice of parallel readings originated during Seleucid times when persecution included a ban on Torah reading. Communal prayer adds to the regular prayers of the privately performed Amidah the Kedushah, triple holy. At the end of the third benediction in morning and afternoon, as well as the Kaddish. Holy in Aramaic, to mark the end of the various segments of the communal prayer and to bring it to a close. The standard prayer book for synagogue worship is called the Siddur order, which is based on the Psalter. The first formal edition dates back to about the 9th century CE.
Are dance and drama equally important?
Bugaku, refined dance in 160 different styles, is often performed to the accompaniment of a gagaku ensemble and sometimes occurs in Buddhist temples as well as Shinto shrines. It is somewhat more formal and classical than Kagura, a uniquely Shinto form of liturgical dance with musical accompaniment. The name apparently derives from a term that means temporary abode of the kami, a place on earth to which worshippers summon the deities. Kagura has its mythic roots in the dance of the terrible female of heaven that lured the sun goddess to emerge from her cave. Unlike the more staid classical version danced for the emperor on December's full moon night. Shrine, or village, Kagura now reenacts often raucous scenes from mythological narratives. Several of the great shrines, such as those of Izumo, Kashiga, and Ise, are especially known for their long-standing traditions of Kagura performance. Some shrines have special structures dedicated to Kagura, but many still stage the dance in the large open space in front of the worship hall. Bon Odori is a popular form of folk dancing performed at festivals on shrine grounds. Celebrants dance around a large, raised, scaffold-like platform on which drummers and other musicians perch to play their popular Hayashi-style music. Perhaps the best known of Shinto-related dances is the dragon dance, often associated with festival parades. In shrine dances, the dragon begins by bowing to the kami and the chief priest before writhing its way across the sacred precincts. The ancient Japanese theater form called No also has roots in the reenactment of Shinto myths.
Have women exercised leadership among deists?
One of the most famous libationers was a woman named Wei Huakun, 251 to 334 CE. Her rank as libationer apparently indicates that she originally belonged to the Celestial Masters school. Some regard her as a foundational figure in the Shangqing sect. She is perhaps most famous for having appeared posthumously on many nights over a 6-year period to reveal to a certain Yangshi the sacred texts of the Shangqing sect. Those texts consist mainly of liturgical ritual. Throughout its long history, the Celestial Masters school has allowed women into the lower rungs of its ritual hierarchy. up to but not including that of Celestial Master itself. Another school, called Pure Rarity, Qingwei, is said to have been founded by a woman named Xiaoshu in the early 10th century. Centered around a thunder deity, the sect blended elements from the Lingbao, Shangqing, and Celestial Masters schools. There have been many priestesses over the centuries, and a celibate community of women maintain a temple in Kaohsiung, Taiwan. Hagiographical sources are extant on a number of holy women of ancient times. They make it clear that women who preferred to pursue the spiritual life rather than devote themselves to family risked almost certain disapproval. Even so, it seems that some women were associated with religious orders. Sun Buletin er. 1119–1182, and her husband were both ritual specialists in the Perfect Realization Order. And she founded a new division of the school dedicated to the religious education of women. A selection of her writings in translation is available in Thomas Cleary's Immortal Sisters. Secret Teachings of Taoist Women. A sect associated especially with the red turbans is popularly called San Nai, Three Ladies. Evidently so named to honor a trio of priestesses about whom little else is known. As has often been the case in other religious traditions, many Chinese women have found possibilities for active leadership and ministry more often outside the institutional structures than within.
Is there such a thing as a Muslim saint?
In addition to sages and prophets, widespread Muslim tradition holds in high regard other individuals singled out for particularly intimate relationships with God. They are called friends of God, Aulia, pronounced Aliyah, singular Vali, and are generally analogous to what Christians and others mean when they refer to saints. A major difference is that friends of God are popularly acclaimed as such rather than formally declared by an institutional procedure. Muslims from Muhammad's own generation are among the earliest individuals called friends of God. Some so designated because of their devotion to the Prophet. Subsequent generations of Muslims have acclaimed friends of God virtually everywhere right on down to modern times, with the notable exception of Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. There and in a few other places, modern reformers have sought to purge Islamic practice of devotional customs judged inauthentic expressions of Islam and distortions of core teachings. They have argued that beseeching friends of God for miracles is simply unnecessary, since no human being can mediate between the individual believer and his or her God. Virtually everywhere else, from Morocco's Marabouts to Indonesia's distinctive Wali Songo, 9 friends of God. Devotion to holy persons has been an important element in the spiritual life of hundreds of millions.
What does the term revelation mean in Jewish tradition?
Multiple descriptions of revelation appear in the Hebrew scriptures. Earlier books depict a strikingly direct relationship between individual people and the Creator. Beginning with Adam and Eve and continuing through the stories of the great patriarchs. We hear of God's forthright communication and self-disclosure. God is depicted as dealing directly with Noah and Abraham. Moses' encounter with the divine presence at the burning bush and on Mt. Sinai are definitive events in the unfolding revelation. The tone and manner of revelation changes somewhat in the historical chronicles of the various kings. See especially I and 2 Samuel, I and 2 Kings, for visions were rare in those days. The sources suggest that God now reveals less through fantastic events and more through the agency of prophets sent to deliver a message, beginning with the court prophets of the early monarchy. Now the prophets hear the divine word not in storm or earthquake or fire, but in a still small voice, I Kings 19:9-12. When the great writing prophets, such as Isaiah and Jeremiah, deliver the message, they simply preface it with the words "Thus says the Lord." Even there, God appears as one who speaks clearly and intimately with select individuals. The Hebrew scriptures are as rich in this kind of imagery as any sacred text on earth. But the most important issue here is not the imagery with which the Scripture describes divine self-disclosure, but the content of the message. Revelation runs the gamut from sanction to solace, from unquenchable wrath to unfathomable mercy.
Are Daoist and CCT sacred spaces marked with any distinctive signs and symbols?
It is not always possible to determine from a Chinese sacred space's exterior design and decor to which of the religious traditions it belongs. Mosques, including those in Chinese settings, have their distinctive minarets, churches have their spires and crosses, and Hindu temples have their monumental facades and towers marking inner shrines. Some Chinese Buddhist temples announce their identity with pagodas or stupas. But that is not always the case. Chinese temple rooflines often display colorful small figures that appear to be engaged in vigorous action. But even these are not a reliable indicator of the holy place's specific religious affiliation. The animated figures on the rooflines are sometimes scenes taken from Chinese opera or classical novels, chosen here because they allude to certain important moral virtues. Inside the temple, more specific clues are available. But even there one has to look carefully to distinguish the sacred symbols of Daoism from those of CCT. For example, a statue of the Bodhisattva Guanyin, originally Buddhist, may appear on a small altar under the covered area toward the front of the inner courtyard. But that does not mean that this is a Buddhist temple. It does, however, indicate that this is not a Daoist temple and probably belongs to CCT, which has borrowed Guanyin from Buddhism and made her an important deity. A Daoist temple's most distinctive symbol is its main altar. Although the overall setting varies from one sect to another, there are several important common features. Before the central deity on the altar stands a perpetually lit lamp symbolizing wisdom and the light of the Deo. 2 candles symbolizing sun and moon flank the lamp a few inches further toward the front of the altar. Cups of water, yang, tea, yin, and uncooked rice, yang and yin united, stand before the candles. Further toward the front of the altar stand 5 plates of fruit, each of a different color, symbolizing the 5 elements in perfect proportion. Centered near the front stands an incense burner, a reminder of the heat that purifies the 3 vital energies symbolized by 3 sticks of incense. Some temporary sacred spaces are constructed of bamboo for specific seasonal deist rituals.
Are there mythic elements in Buddhist tradition?
Mythic expression plays a far less central role in Buddhist teaching than in Hinduism. In fact, you might say one of the Buddha's main concerns was to demythologize Hindu tradition as he had received it. Hindu myth introduces believers to the impenetrable mystery of the divine while attempting to describe how the divine presence infuses the world of human experience. The Buddha cautioned against taking refuge in myth. However potent the divine presence may be, it does not relieve human beings of ultimate responsibility for their own choices. As in so many religious traditions, the foundational figure himself soon became the focal point of a new mythology. Even the most hardcore Theravada tradition leaves room for the Buddha to expand into a being of supramundane qualities. Wondrous tales of the Buddha's previous lives, the Jatakas radiate mythic energy. Some of the Mahayana denominations and sects, those of the widely popular Pure Land variety in particular, evolved their own complex descriptions of a multi-level cosmos, ruled by multiple Buddhas and populated by countless lesser spiritual powers as well. Vajrayana Buddhism, represented especially by various Tibetan lineages, retained much of ancient Hinduism's mythic spirit and cast of characters. But the Tibetans interiorized the myth, interpreting the many spiritual beings as projections of the inner powers with which one identifies through meditative practice. Even in popular Mahayana and the more esoteric Vajrayana teachings, mythic elements never attain quite the centrality they enjoy in Hindu tradition.
Is there a central Shinto teaching authority?
Shinto's close identification over the centuries with Japanese culture and imperial rule has sometimes made it appear that the royal administration functioned as a central religious authority. Certain regimes have made concerted efforts to encourage uniformity of traditional thinking among the Japanese people, and that has sometimes involved official statements about Shinto. beliefs as well as attempts to centralize the organization of large numbers of shrines. In addition, training for Shinto ritual specialists in recent times has devolved on only a select few educational institutions very much associated with national identity. Those academic religious organizations have set themselves the task of clarifying and, in some cases, restructuring the countless elements of ancient Shinto tradition into a coherent system. Theirs has been an increasingly theological enterprise in modern times. Even so, Shinto tradition has remained quite fluid and inclusive, and far less identified with definitive teaching authority than, say, Roman Catholicism. Over the centuries, various centralized institutions have come and gone. The Institute of the Great Teaching, Daikyo-in, for example, was motivated largely by the desire to root out Buddhist and Christian influences in 19th century Japan. The Bureau of Divinity, Jinjikan, sought to unify the administration of shrines and the appointment of priests. It is perhaps best to think of the centralized authority as regulating matters of practice rather than of belief, setting out detailed instructions for rituals, Jinjia Shaishiki, and for coordinating observances nationally.
Is the term revelation useful in understanding Shinto tradition?
All religious traditions are oriented in varying degrees to two great inseparable realities: truth and power. Some, such as the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, tend to tilt slightly toward truths that human beings cannot discern without direct help from the source of truth itself. Others, such as Taoism, focus more on teaching believers how to discern and benefit from the well springs of power. Shinto is far more concerned with power than with truth. This is obviously an oversimplification. But what it means is that the power of the divine and its implications are the only important truths.
What is at the heart of the Confucian Temple?
Looking into the courtyard, you would see the main structure, the freestanding central memorial hall on a raised platform. Until the 14th century, most if not all Confucian temples would have had a full complement of statues of Confucius and the other major sages. As a result of an imperial decree in 1530, some date the change to 1382. Pictures and statues of the great teacher and his spiritual comrades were replaced by memorial spirit tablets bearing the names of the sages and scholars. The main hall's Dezheng central altar houses the tablets of Confucius, named the most holy former master, the wise Kong, and his four most important followers: Yanhui, Zusi, Zhengzi, and Mengzi. Over the central altar is a panel that reads "Teach without discrimination." In other words, accept all sincere comers as potential students. Along the right and left walls of the main hall are side altars, each bearing 6 tablets commemorating the 12 sages, 11 students of Confucius and one of the founders of the medieval development called Neo-Confucianism, Zhu Shi, 1130 to 1200 CE. In the rooms along the right and left sides of the main courtyard you would see several more altars on which are enshrined 154 more name tablets. 40 sages and 37 scholars on the east, 39 sages and 38 scholars on the west. These major historical figures represent the cream of the literati over many centuries. Finally, behind the main memorial hall, along the north wall of the courtyard, stands a room, the Yongzheng, enshrining tablets of 5 generations of Confucius ancestors.
How do Jews deal ritually with death?
Most Jews do not observe the custom of the wake, either at the mortuary or in the private home, since embalming is not customary. Cremation is not ordinarily done. Family members prepare the body and burial ideally occurs within a day of death. Sitting Shiva refers to a 7 Shiva day period of mourning for a family member. Friends and relatives visit the home of the deceased to extend their sympathy and pray with the family. Every period of 7 days naturally includes a Sabbath. But on that day mourners refrain from manifesting their grief outwardly. Among Ashkenazic Jews in some countries, groups called Hevra Kadisa, Holy Brotherhood, may be available to provide burial services for the needy. The custom of observing the anniversary or yahrzeit of a relative's death involves visiting the grave and reciting the mourner's Kaddish, a prayer in praise of the Holy One whose dominion is everlasting.
Who are Theravada Buddhists?
Theravada Buddhists are members of a more or less homogeneous community of faith and worship built around the notion that the Buddha was a human being who taught by example. The historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, was the last of many non-human and human reincarnations of the Buddha to be a separate school from the Second Council on in the 4th century BCE. Their main scriptures are called collectively the Pali Canon. Theravadins seek deliverance from rebirth by eliminating craving and ignorance through self-discipline. The ideal and model of the enlightened life is the Arhat. Arhats benefit others chiefly by their example, and they possess no saving power as such. They embody primarily the virtue of wisdom. Their ultimate goal, nirvana, is a state beyond this world of samsara in which the liberated person experiences neither desire nor impressions of any kind. Theravada sources describe nirvana as a permanent pleasant state of knowledge, freedom, and peace that is largely the result of a process of personal effort. When Theravadins pray, their primary intent is more to honor the Buddha than to worship him. All good acts, including religious ritual, done with proper intent can help one gain merit toward the eradication of negative karma. For most Theravada Buddhists, the concepts of merit making and merit transfer are more basic and accessible than the kind of lofty ethical and spiritual discipline embodied in an arhat. There are, of course, some regional and cultural variations in Theravada expression and practice, but considerably less so than in the other main branches of Buddhist tradition.
What are some of the main sources of religious sign and symbol?
Virtually any visual design or gesture can be used in religious contexts. Religious traditions draw on a limitless supply of natural and invented materials. From nature come a huge host of candidates from the animal kingdoms. Birds seem especially apt symbols. Sometimes as images of the human spirit or soul. Sometimes reminders of the utter freedom and beauty of the deity. Fish are also particularly evocative, dwelling as they do in a medium ungenial to human beings and thus capable of suggesting the otherness of the holy. Powerful beasts of prey as well as animals known for their gentleness often stir the religious imagination. Trees, along with every imaginable kind of flower, find symbolic place in numerous traditions. Among inanimate natural things, heavenly luminaries and constellations have numerous resonances with qualities often associated with the divine. Sometimes related to astronomical symbols are the myriad geometric forms found across the whole spectrum of traditions, with the same form playing very different roles from one to another.
Did Confucian tradition spread beyond China?
Confucian themes pervade the cultures of both Korea and Japan. Temples dedicated to Confucius have never been nearly as numerous in either country as Buddhist temples or Shinto shrines. For example, and today very few active ones remain. But the influence of the master is still discernible everywhere. Much of that influence is due to a long history of cultural and diplomatic relations between China and Korea. As early as the 7th century, Korean rulers welcomed Confucian thought as a master plan for political administration. Under the Koryo dynasty, 918-1392 CE, Confucianism took its place alongside of divination and Buddhism as the third in a triad of essential traditional teachings. Korean Confucianism reached its zenith during the long-lived Yi dynasty, 1392 to 1910. There was a time, Koreans occasionally point out, when even the Chinese confessed that their Korean neighbors had outdone them in devotion to Confucius. In Seoul, a Confucian university called Sungkyunkwan remains an important symbol of the tradition's impact on Korea. Confucian tradition came to Japan via Korea around 400 CE, a century and a half before Buddhism. Early Confucian scholars brought Chinese ideas to the Japanese imperial court, diffusing concepts that would go on to become an integral part of Japanese culture. Today the once elegant Confucian temple in downtown Tokyo has few visitors and is badly in need of repair. But Confucian ideals of family and social relationships are still part of the cultural air the Japanese people breathe.
Do Buddhists use special symbols when they engage in personal or private rituals?
A number of prayer aids and other ritual accoutrements are common in many Buddhist households. Prayer wheels and prayer flags, used especially in the Himalayan nations but elsewhere as well, symbolize the belief in the ideal of continual prayer. Prayer wheels contain bits of sacred text inside a small drum fitted with an axle-like handle. A short weighted chain attached to the drum makes it easier to spin it steadily. Prayer flags are strips of cloth containing sacred text and petitions, prayers sped aloft by the winds. Many Japanese households have a small altar, called the Butsudan, in which families keep tablets with the names of deceased relatives as well as images of the Buddha. In general, private rituals employ a scaled-down set of the same principal symbols used for temple worship.
How are Christian religious leaders chosen, educated, and given authority?
Candidates for ministry and governance in most churches simply present themselves for admission to the appropriate educational branches of their organizations. Seminaries oversee the special ministerial training of church members. Many refer to the desire to enter the ministry as a vocation or a calling from God. In some cases, members of many denominations take their ministerial theological education at nunnery, multi-denominational seminaries or schools of divinity, generally emerging after 3 or 4 years with a Master of Divinity. Master of Divinity, degree or its equivalent. Some students may pursue further studies toward a Doctor of Ministry. D.Min, degree or a PhD, hence the common appellation Reverend Doctor. Protestant ministers more often than not obtain their pastoral appointments at local churches of their denominations through the mechanism of the call, whereby a congregation interviews prospective pastors and then invites its first choice. Catholic bishops generally appoint priests of their dioceses to specific parishes without consulting the local congregations. Orthodox and other Eastern Church administrators sometimes exercise a similar appointive authority.